Sager, and I founded Nanosolar 7 years ago to enable low-cost, inexpensive electricity to be affordable throughout the world. How did this company come into being? It required several factors which are perhaps somewhat unusual to think through. The first is that it required absolutely no industry background. By having no prior knowledge of the solar industry, we questioned, as we developed the technology, every legacy assumption in the industry. I would encourage thinking through the issues associated with our current energy landscape in the same manner. What do I mean by that? First of all, to think through the true cost of energy, both from their environmental impact and from their pricing. From the environmental impact, to recognize that there is solar technology, wind technology, hydro technology today, which is hundreds of times less environmentally impactful than coal or natural gas. Secondly, from the standpoint of pricing, there's a common framework that coal, nuclear, and gas are far less expensive than renewable energy sources. And in reality, they are very much at the same parity level. What's not generally acknowledged, and where we need more honesty, is that the cost of coal, gas, and nuclear are far higher than they have been accounted for, in part because the transmission costs, the distribution costs, are generally not considered as part of the equation. So that pushes up the general cost of coal, for example, from 4 cents or 5 cents per kilowatt hour closer to 10 to 15 cents per kilowatt hour. Secondly, some sources of energy, such as solar technology, cost far less than are generally acknowledged. The reality is that we are at grid parity today. This does not require a massive technological advance, does not require a Manhattan Project for solar. The technology is already at that level today. The question is how to have this become more widespread. It requires several things. It requires recognizing, first of all, that there are several limiting factors in adoption of the market. On the one hand, we need a policy which allows for stable demand. For example, national feed-in tariffs, which allow people to produce solar at a certain price point and sell it to an entity that would buy it at a contracted price over many years. These have been successfully employed in Europe, and they could be established here as well. National renewable portfolio standards, a set of frameworks which require utilities to purchase a certain amount of power through renewable energy sources. They exist now in a patchwork across the country, state by state and region by region, but they could be far more harmonized in a way that stimulates market demand. More importantly, these policies need to be stable. They need to transcend an election cycle, whether on the federal level, the state, the county, or the city, so that people who are investing money in a solar power plant project, for example, know that the structure in which their project was initially formed is going to be stable for the life of the project. This has worked successfully in other parts of the world and could be incorporated here as well. Another key aspect of this is the manufacturability of the technologies that have been developed. Require extensive capital getting from the R&D stage to a full factory. Setting up a federal program, for example, the Department of Energy's loan guarantee program, but others potentially, for example, capital grants, could help accelerate that as well. When we formed Nanosolar, we were told by venture capitalists that, first of all, we were crazy. There was no point in forming a solar company because where was the Cisco of solar? Where was the Microsoft of solar? Secondly, it was far too expensive and the price was not going to come down in the near term, and it was not technologically feasible to do what we had planned to do. 7 years and $500 million later, we've built the largest factories in the world and are producing power now that is at grid parity and will revolutionize, I believe, the way people use power throughout countries that have access to sunlight, which is pretty much the entire world. Those same folks in the venture capital community who several years ago ridiculed our business plan now position themselves as clean tech partners who have large portfolios of solar companies, wind companies, energy efficiency companies, and so forth. So there has been a sea change in the private equity world. Now that sea change needs to move from private equity to the federal government, where folks in the Department of Energy, in the Treasury Department, in OMB, and all the various departments recognize and work together to realize that the energy economy requires a real shift The technology is there. The capital is potentially available. Public-private partnerships are one way to approach that, but federal support, for example, the National Feed-in Tariff, renewable portfolio standards, and the like, are a great way to stimulate demand and keep it in a stable way which is attractive to potential investors. At the same time, we need to stimulate supply. That requires keeping manufacturing entities in the United States and not exporting them to third world countries where we lose access to the technology and the innovations that are driving those technological companies. Ways to do that would include capital grants for manufacturing to subsidize the cost of new factory build-out, especially for pre-revenue companies, and some very mundane things, sales tax being eliminated for companies that are pre-revenue or having a delay in sales tax, property taxes being eliminated or delayed until a company grows. This may seem like a small thing to someone who's not an entrepreneur, but when you're building a $100 million factory or a $500 million factory and you have to give 10% back to a taxation authority before you've had a single dollar of revenue, that becomes an issue. Many of our fellow startup companies are experiencing this, and the way in which many companies are resolving this issue is to move overseas. So if the goal is to help the United States in the United States, support needs to be made to enable the entrepreneurs to stay here in a way where their business case can be made to their investors in a way that's defensible. So that would help to stimulate supply and demand. And then the question is, how do you match supply with demand? There's been a lot of discussion about cap and trade, for example, for carbon trading. It's a great idea conceptually. The question is, how is it actually administered? How do you build a market when you have very few people buying or selling it? The transaction volume is very low. It's very difficult to value particular transactions or particular credits. So the question is, how do you go about building that kind of a market? You want to create an incentive in which energy efficiency is prominent, in which environmentally friendly technologies are used to produce energy, but at the same time you want to create a fair playing field for smaller companies that are just moving up and just beginning to produce product that could potentially enable that challenge to be resolved. To do that, we need to have a carbon market that is mature, and right now it is not in that state. No one that I know of in the entrepreneurial community even takes renewable energy credits seriously right now. Finally, I'd like to point out that the quickest way and the easiest way to help with the energy economy is to reduce demand. A lot of folks are doing carbon footprinting of their own lifestyles to see what they're really doing, but there are very simple ways to think through conservation. It's not simply turning the light bulbs off at night. It's also the way we eat, the way we sleep, the way we drive, the way we travel. There are many ways to reduce this. One example is eating meat, which, for example, every pound of meat per pound of grain requires 80 times the amount of water, 7 times the amount of land, and 20 times the amount of energy. So that's one example, and there are many potential examples of that. So conservation is one way to reduce demand. Enabling stable market growth through feed-in tariffs and renewable portfolio standards and utilities is one way to stabilize demand. And supply could be enabled by allowing manufacturing entities to arise from the proven concepts and proof of concepts that are already in place in a lot of entrepreneurial companies throughout the United States.